Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me, or I should say good morning to those of us more on the west coast of North America, but a happy Thursday to everyone joining us today from wherever you are. Um, on December 1st of all days, to actually start to explore a little bit about leadership, the leadership skills that are going to make a big difference for leaders. And we'll be kind of wearing two hats today. One, as we think about ourselves and the leadership roles that we might all play, how some of these skills are things that we should actually take on and maybe focus a little bit more time on our own development, but also as a number of professionals who operate in that development space, who maybe work with leaders directly in terms of becoming better leaders, how these top skills that we're going to cover today can make at times a critical difference for how people will perform. My name is Shawn Bakker. I'm the lead psychologist here at Psychometrics Canada. And I like to think of our kind of driving passion is really to help people find what I like to term our aha moments. Learning aspects about themselves or others that really relate to them in the workspace, or how they pursue their career, really with the goal of how do we help individuals identify and then realize that potential that we all have. I'm a firm believer that leaderships are made, they're not born. And as a result, to be made requires that focus on some development, some activity, some introspection. And here in Edmonton today, where Psychometrics is located, we woke up to about 5-6 centimeters of snow. So it is cold and white outside, and it seems like a perfect day to sit in where it's warm, maybe do a little bit of that introspection and consider this concept of leadership. Now, before we jump into that, just a quick little housekeeping. The webinar is going to be recorded and that will be sent out to everyone, as well as a copy of the slides will be sent out to you also when the webinar is completed. So what I'm hoping then, you can devote some of your time just to some consideration of the topics that we're going to cover today and realize that all the details will be coming to you afterwards. Now, where I would like to actually start is with a brief chat about leadership and how we define that in our work at Psychometrics. So we really see leadership as that process of social influence that maximizes the effort of others towards the achievement of goals. And I think each of those phrases are critically important. One, because they speak to the broad and multifaceted nature of leadership. So that idea of a pro-social influence, for example, as leaders exercising leadership, it is inspiring people, it's motivating others, it's influencing without coercion. And I think that's a really important part about leadership. If leadership is just direction of doing what you are told, that's not really social influence. That's more of a power dynamic. And instead, as leaders, we're looking to influence people through a motivating, empowering, encouraging type of way. Now, maximizing the efforts of others, of course, is using that influence to energize people, to get them to rise to their full potential, to allow them to use all of the skills that they have in that workspace towards the achievement of a goal, which is really as we come together as groups of people, we're working towards something. Hopefully that is a shared vision, one that's desirable, that people then can get behind, have bought into, and are curious and excited about pursuing. Now, the reason why I really like this definition of leadership is because it captures two things. There's a humanizing aspect to it, as well as a systemizing aspect to it. That as leaders, we find ourselves engaging with people to get things done within a human component and also a work kind of system and a structure, which also speaks to why leadership I often see as a generalist position. And as a result, that then requires generalist skills, skills that are multifaceted that we will use then in a variety of different situations. Now, as we jump into looking at some of these leadership skills, there's one big thing I want to get out of the way right away, and that is good leadership's hard. It takes work. And while we're going to explore a number of the skills for leaders to be effective in today's day and age, they don't just come to us like that. It is going to take some effort, that's going to take some frustration as well. And so something that I always tell for leaders that I'm actually working with is there are times where it's going to be frustrating, where I may not feel it's going as well as it is. And that really is the process of learning. And that's a key thing for all of us. We actually know deep down people love to learn, and we're actually going to touch base on that a little bit here today. But recognize learning important things comes with some challenges. Now, the information that I'll be sharing today, really I've pulled from, let's just say, kind of a snapshot of the last 2 years of research in that leadership area, as well as some of assessment data that we have access to here at Psychometrics, that gives us a bit of an insight into how are people carrying themselves and operating in today's work world. So to kick off, what I'd be curious about, for those of you who are attending live, what do you see leaders struggling with the most? And just wondering if some things come to mind, if you could enter that into the question bar. The chat one's not one that'll actually work, but if you can enter it into the question bar, just the things that you see leaders struggling with the most. And we're looking for a recency effect here. What are you seeing the most recent? What in today's day and age is really jumping out for you as the areas where leaders are struggling? So we're seeing things come through already. One, managing time, having difficult conversations, resilience, working with unmotivated workers, feeling threatened by others' knowledge. Wow, that is actually one I've seen a number of times too. Balancing leadership with multiple demands, connecting with employees, delivering feedback, communicating from remote locations, holding people accountable, balancing work and HR. So even with that, a sample here that we have gathered in the span of 30 seconds, we can see leadership is actually tough, isn't it? Because what are we seeing here? Having difficult conversations, managing young workers' expectations, and delivering corporate messages. And guess what? As leaders, you get to do that all at the exact same time. It's not easy. I'm not looking to let leaders off the hook here, of course, but I'm just saying there's a difficulty to it and a challenge that as people in the leadership development space, we need to recognize that these are things that will take some time and some work. Last few that have come through: navigating change, emotional intelligence, holding people accountable. Wow. Over this last little while, here is what we found at Psychometrics are those common areas where leaders have actually struggled. So we see number one, obviously related to communication. Number two, short-term thinking. And by that, what I mean is we found that leaders are focused a lot on the day-to-day rather than more the long-term aspects of leadership. Avoiding conflict. So the struggle is not avoiding conflict. The struggle actually is they avoid conflict too much, putting things off, of course, and not addressing them. The fourth one is a lack of collaboration. And then the fifth one is struggling with managing change. And when I say managing change, really it is as a leader, helping other people through changes that are actually occurring. When you look at these, a lot of them have a very strong personal human component to them. They also are very broad generalist types of skills: communicating, long-term thinking, dealing with conflict, collaborating, and dealing with the changes that things bring. And I think as leaders then, where you focus your development, that becomes a critical area to consider. So for this next year, and based on the results and the information that I found over the last 2 years, these are the top skills that we've seen as really having a strong impact on leaders and leaders' effectiveness today, and then also what I would say is for the year to come as well. So the top one is asking for feedback. Number two is involving others, then developing people, managing change, and engaging in conflict. And we're going to explore these 5 skills in depth and share some tips on how to dig into it a little bit, how leaders can develop them, and then also a bit of information about why it actually is so important, skills in these areas. And we're also presenting them, or I'm also presenting them in an order that really is stacked in essence of a list of priorities. Um, so getting feedback is number one for leaders. Feedback builds self-awareness, and that's going to benefit all of those areas that actually will follow. So if we move to the first one, asking for feedback, I really see this is a foundation for being a good leader because it feeds into and builds self-awareness. And time again, we've seen how self-awareness is so important for leaders, and it leads to so many positive outcomes. From starting point of individual work performance to how well can they manage tasks, how good do they make decisions, how well do they coordinate and collaborate with their teams, and how well can they actually manage conflict. So that acquiring self-awareness really I see as a critical starting point for any leader. Now, unfortunately, most leaders operate in an environment that's a little bit, let's call it naturally feedback deficient. It's not common, it's not particularly comfortable for direct reports or colleagues to voluntarily provide suggestions for improvement, comments, or advice to leaders. And as a result, this can leave leaders operating in a bit of a vacuum, and that can lead to some false assumptions. So some leaders thinking, well, actually, I do think I run really good meetings. I think I am a fantastic communicator. I do believe that our quarterly goals are well understood by everyone and they know how to execute on them. But that may not necessarily be true. Jack Zegner from Zegner Folkman does a lot of work in the area of leadership, and wrote this article and had this great phrase in it that just really jumped out for me. And he said, feedback is not governed by gravity. I'm like, wow. And really what he goes on to say is that feedback should flow upward as well as downward. But for that to happen, it requires some extra effort. It's not going to happen naturally. So we know if we let water go, it'll go downhill, and that'll happen naturally. If we want to move water up a hill, we need to actually exert some external force on that. And so that's where leaders need to start asking for feedback. And why that matters, here's a bit of research from Zegner Folkman in a recent study that they did with 52,000 executives. So those people who rarely asked for feedback, when ranked on their overall leadership effectiveness, fell at the 15th percentile. For those who often ask for feedback, their overall leadership effectiveness is rated at the 86th percentile. That's a huge difference. And really, in the broadest stroke of things, it goes from below average to above average, based on, are you asking for feedback? So one thing we know, leaders probably don't ask for it often enough. But the real trick of asking for it is not just saying, can you help me out? Can you give me some feedback? But it is, how do we actually go about asking? And so to effectively gather feedback, the first thing that leaders need to actually do is they need to make sure that they focus on one thing at a time. What they need to ask for is one specific recommendation or one suggestion on how one specific thing can be improved. That can be, how well do they put together reports? How well did they host a meeting? How did a presentation go? Asking a broad question, how am I doing, does not provide leaders with that concrete or actionable feedback that they actually need to get better. So when you ask employees, well, how am I doing? One, that's a pretty vague question. Two, it can be actually very uncomfortable for direct reports as well. Where do you actually start? So as leaders, focus on asking for feedback about something that you're either doing frequently or you think is really important to your current leadership role, and get that specific feedback from them. Now, this next stage of asking for feedback should be pretty self-evident, but I've included it because it's not. And that is actually saying thanks. As a leader, when you get feedback, say thank you for it, express your appreciation for the suggestions that you're receiving, and withhold your tendency that you might have of arguing why you do things the way that you do, or excuses for acting why you acted the way that you actually acted. The goal is take the feedback and seek to understand it. Don't try to argue against it. And then the third point, if you're asking for feedback, make sure you take action on it. Um, make a plan, engage an external coach, ask for feedback on how progress has actually been happening. It's critical for leaders, if you are going to come across as authentic and sincere, that when you ask for feedback, you do something with it. And then the fourth thing is make it a habit. Soliciting feedback and acting on it needs to become a common, in essence, a common activity as a part of a leader's approach. It's never a one and done thing. Instead, it needs to be an ongoing process. And that feedback then becomes the critical feedstock for building self-awareness. And we'll see will also leverage itself through these other skills that we're talking about as well. If you're really at a loss, how do I start asking for feedback? Ask if you can participate in a 360 assessment. A pretty structured, designed approach to actually gather feedback from a lot of people, and for many leaders can be a great start if that's where you're looking to begin. Skill number 2, I've labeled as involving others, but you could also describe it as inclusive leadership, collaborative leadership. Some people might even simply use the word simply as teamwork. And the reason why that is critical, McKinsey did a bunch of research over the last couple of years when everyone was talking about the Great Resignation. And they found that the top 3 reasons why employees were quitting, it wasn't because of money that they were receiving, it wasn't work hours, but it was not feeling valued by the organization or their manager and not having a sense of belonging. That relational elements are what drive people away from workspaces, not transactional elements. And so focusing on those relational elements becomes critical. So as inclusive leaders, what we need to start thinking about is how do we move and start mobilizing away from the elite few to the diverse many? And by that, what I mean is leaders need to make sure that they are mobilizing and including more, if not all, of their employees. Now, that's not to say include them in everything, but start looking at including more people than they typically do in the past. The complexity that we're seeing that most people need to solve in the work today are best solved by bringing in different perspectives, different skill sets, people who look and see things differently. And as you expand from this, what I call the elite few, which in essence means as a leader, what comes to mind to you right away of people to include? If you can expand that into your world, though, you actually bring in a multiplicity of perspectives. And while that takes some effort to work through, the end results, research shows, are so much better. Like your groups will become better problem solvers. They will become better product makers by incorporating and including a more diverse group together. So how do we pull that off? Well, first part I see is a bit of a philosophical change, and that is leaders seeing themselves as facilitators rather than directors. So as a facilitator, what you are doing is you're providing an environment where people can come together and collaborate, where they can share ideas and you can focus on shared problem solving and the multiple of perspectives that people can bring to say, what's working well, what's not working, how could we actually resolve it more effectively? And that requires a leader who comes in to facilitate things rather than a leader who says, I'll make the final choices, I'll tell people what to do. The second thing then is a focus on sharing. And by sharing, what I mean is as a leader, share problem solving and decision making whenever possible. Be open to other people's ideas, ask other people what their ideas are, how they might go about solving them, and come at what I would see as a shared resolution. Now, this actually becomes a bit of an offload for leaders. It's not an offloading of the responsibility, but it is sharing of the burden. That when other people solve problems together, the problem becomes the group's problem. And you find that you'll have much more discretionary effort actually gets applied, and your solutions are so much better as well. The third thing for involving others then is recognizing people's contributions. And the research is incredibly clear on this. If you do employee recognition well, it has huge payoffs. So every measure of morale gets boosted, productivity, performance, customer satisfaction, employee retention, they all go up when leaders provide timely recognition for employees. Um, the big trick, make sure that it's meaningful to each and every one of your employees, so that actually resonates. So you need to actually know your people in order to do that well. Skill number 3 that I see as critical for this next year is focusing on the development of their people. So leaders really looking for ways to help their direct reports and the others in their workspace grow and develop. In our work with career values, which we've based on kind of the work of Donald Super, his theory was that every one of us have a series of priorities or values, things that if it's in our workspace, we find satisfying and motivating and energy. And if it's not, we find somewhat dissatisfying or kind of pulls us away. You can see in the chart here is a list of those 10 common career values. The column on the left, they're very people-oriented. The column in the middle I would describe as kind of intrinsic or internal motivators. And the column on the right I would describe as those extrinsic or external motivators that come from the workplace. Now, for every one of us, we could stick these kind of in an order of importance to us. And an amazing thing that we've actually seen over the last 2 years has been a significant increase in one of them, and that is the value of career development. That more people are reporting that for them to find their work satisfying, engaging, and one that they want to continue to come to is they need to see an opportunity for development, learning, and advancement. 50% more people are reporting that as a critical value for them than they did before the pandemic. And career development was always a key driver for people. It's actually just becoming more so. So as leaders, we need to recognize people are saying, I have a desire to learn new skills. I want to continue to develop. I enjoy some challenges and I want to move forward rather than stagnate. And as leaders then, for 2023 to successfully lead people, conversations need to happen in this area. So how do we do that? Well, I've got a couple just key questions for leaders to actually ask. I often consider these as aspects of a stay interview because I know as we engage in developing people, they're much more likely to be engaged. They're also much more likely to actually stay with the organization rather than leave to find those developmental opportunities. So the first thing as a leader for your employees, what are they passionate about? Do you know this? This is a critical question to ask, a great way to start that relationship building, and then to make it a little more concrete. Do you think that your talents, interests, and skills are being fully utilized? And then thirdly, what professional or career opportunities are you excited about pursuing? Then, and here comes a critical thing for leaders, you just need to listen. You don't need to land with a development plan immediately. You just need to start initially with a listening of what are these key things for people. After you've listened, you can then start to look at some action. And once again, how do you do that? You should build those plans in an inclusive way with direct reports themselves, rather than saying, I've heard what you're passionate about, and now here are the steps that I've put out for you. This needs to be a joint exercise for it to really work effectively and well. The fourth key skill that I see for 2023 for leaders is managing change. Managing change has been a challenge and a critical skill for leaders for a long time. Because guess what? Change doesn't actually stop. And as a result of that, you can see this idea of change is actually huge. There's change management programs. There's a lot of different options of ways that we can look at change as leaders, change with people, change in systems. But what I want to focus on today is one of those key requirements of as a leader is helping employees manage that change. And that really requires an understanding of the human element and a focus on relationships during those times of change. So now, one thing we know about change in and of itself is that most people don't actually mind change. In many areas, they'll actually embrace it if it makes sense. And I bet if you think about your own life, you'll probably have found opportunities where you recognize you've changed a lot. Maybe it's a new job, you've changed your wardrobe, you go on vacations to different places, you're getting your hair cut different, you decided to try out a new restaurant. So change is something that people are actually quite open to. Um, However, the challenge for people actually is uncertainty. Um, and when faced with uncertainty, what people tend to do is they want to start asking questions. And then previously, what I've said is they might moan a little bit, and it often happens in the same instant, and it kind of comes across like, why? What are they thinking? And these questions are often labeled then as being resistant to change, when actually what those questions are is people actively trying to understand. So for leaders to better manage change or help people manage change, what you need to start doing is helping people answer those why questions. As we can better answer why questions, what you end up doing as a leader is you reduce the uncertainty for your people. And you also end up actually thinking through things better. So I have a series of 4 questions that really help answer the why. And as a leader, if you can't answer these questions, then it's going to be hard for people to understand the changes that are taking place. It also means likely that the change hasn't been particularly well thought out. So the first why question really relates to what I see as macro factors. What is it about the global situation that explains why the change needs to be made? As leaders, we need to be able to answer that. The second one then is the micro. What is not working right now? And how do the proposed changes respond to those immediate challenges? The third thing you need to fill the blank in is for hearts. What are the values that are driving the change? And then lastly, minds. What is the logic behind the change? If you can fill in these 4 blanks with the macro, the micro, the hearts, and the minds, what you have done is you're covering a number of bases, and what you actually communicate to people is going to answer the 4 big buckets of questions that people generally have about the change. And it starts with, well, what's going on in the world that speaks to why the change needs to be? That's macro. And then it shifts to micro. But what about what we're doing is not working, and how is that going to impact me? What are the values of our organization that are coming into play? And what were the pros and cons of the alternatives that were weighed? Reasoning your way through those, and what I would suggest is you do that with others, will make it much easier for people to understand and then implement change as it comes about. The other critical thing for change is communication. Leaders need to be very visible. They need to engage in dialogue, what I would say is earlier and much more often than they naturally do. Um, Towers and Watson did some research about, in essence, change initiatives that were brought through in large organizations. And what they found is that when they got to the senior management level, 68% of them said, we get it, we understand why the change is taking place. Then they got to the middle managers level, only 53% of them kind of had a clear understanding of why the change was taking place. Frontline supervisors, it actually dropped to 40%. So within kind of the layers of what we might term as management, within an organizational hierarchy, at the connection where there is the biggest interaction between employees and management, the frontline supervisors, only 40% of the frontline supervisors understand what's going on. So expecting then that number to be actually higher for employees is incredibly unrealistic. So what we've seen is that leaders don't communicate often enough. They give up because they said, I've said it once, they should understand it. Um, Failing to realize that what you need to do is share that message over and over and over again. As a leader, you will be sick about talking about it. By the time you're there, maybe you're getting close to having that kind of penetration of understanding that you actually need. So as a leader, communicate, communicate, communicate. The fifth and last key skill that I see for this next year is engaging in conflict. And so what I mean is not as leaders going out there and starting conflicts with people, but instead addressing those areas where there are differences of opinion. Um, so if any of you have worked with the Thomas Kilmann before, you know that one of the key things for that whole model is the definition of conflict, which is really any situation where one person's concerns or desires differ from those of another person. So really, it's just we have differences of opinions, we have different ideas. So you would imagine then that work realistically should be full of areas of conflict, because that means people are actually coming together and they're sharing different concerns, different desires, and then they need to resolve them in some way. And it's the resolving of it where those differences of opinion can actually identify areas of win-win, where you can actually find extensive value. But that actually requires an engagement in the discussion. And leaders need to recognize then that conflict is healthy when it's those differences of opinion. Um, Now, we're not talking about physical violence. We're not talking about verbal or mental abuse. Although as leaders, by golly, you can't avoid that. You need to jump into that immediately. However, in that typical workplace conflict where people are looking at something and seeing different things, leaders need to make sure that they are engaging in those disagreements and that a resolution is brought about, because that is where value comes from the group of people and the team. So those of you who've worked with the TKI, this model will look familiar. Here's 5 of the conflict modes and the approach to handling conflict. Now, we've seen an interesting thing over the course of the pandemic. And what we've actually noticed is that competing, collaborating, and compromising, people are using less often. And the people, as they're moving away from these competing, compromising, and collaborating, or the C conflict modes, they're landing here down at avoiding or accommodating. Now, when you look at this model, you can see that there's 2 axes. There's an assertiveness one and there's a cooperativeness one. Assertiveness is how much do you share, push, desire to kind of express your own opinions, whereas cooperativeness is how much are you willing to kind of go along with what other people see and think. And so what we're really seeing right now in the workspace is an underuse of competing, compromising, and collaborating, and an overuse of avoiding and accommodating. And that has an impact on groups. An underuse of competing can lead to indecision and delayed action. Underuse of compromising results in a lack of effective negotiating. And an underuse in collaborating actually results in less innovation, less empowerment, and less win-wins in groups. On the flip side, an overuse of avoiding, which is what we're seeing now, results in issues that start to fester, a climate that's much more cautious, and then decisions that are made by default, that the clocks run out. So the decision's not made by the group, but the decision's made by circumstances. And then the result of overusing accommodating are people's ideas being overlooked, individuals not having a contribution or having a limited influence. So as leaders then, it really becomes critical of how do we actually engage in conflict, recognizing that when does conflict happen the most? Well, during unexpected issues and during times of change. And so in these times, what leaders need to do is they need to be more assertive. And by that, I mean not telling people what to do, but in making sure that people share their ideas, their thoughts, and their reactions. So as leaders need to be much more solicitative of other people's ideas. Ask them, what are they thinking? What are they seeing? what do they think would be the best result or the best path forward. And in essence, what you're doing is you're dragging people then into the discussion of differences of opinions. Because as leaders, your goal can't be to avoid conflict, it's to deal with it effectively. And of course, what do we know? Dealing with it effectively means choosing one of these 5 modes. They're all going to be appropriate at special times, but you need to choose the right one based on the current situation that you are actually in. The last area that I want to touch on is really for those of us in the leadership developmental space. How do we start to bring this together for leaders? And a model that I've always found just really useful for exploring that is from Byron Hanson. This is called his leadership development interface. And it's a great holistic model of how do we help leaders develop effectively. And what it requires is making sure that we address each of these 4 areas. So on the top left, self-reflection and discovery is leaders need to have a clear understanding of who they are, what their character is, what their personal vision is for leadership, and take that with them to any leadership activity. The bottom left, multi-level feedback, once again, for leaders to develop effectively, they need to have information that comes back to them. How are they doing? Are they on the right track? Do they need to make some changes? Are things working the way they should be? Or do they need to develop some new skills? Context and practice actually then speaks to, for leaders to effectively develop, they need to be put in the working world where they can actually try things on. You can't really see me as I'm sitting down. I'm tall. I played a lot of basketball when I was younger. I could sit and read about basketball all I wanted, but you don't actually get better at it until you're actually out there playing the game. And so for leaders, that means you need to jump in, you need to practice things. At times you may make mistakes. That is to be expected, and that's going to be okay. What's not okay is not having the contextual areas to practice in. So if you're a leadership development practitioner in an organization, this really comes to the fore in stretch assignments, stretch projects, opportunities for leaders to try on their new skills. The 4th area then to address, of course, is the top right in learning and development. And this really fits where a lot of us have put effort before in the past, which are those formal and structured learning experiences for leaders. So our key skills, again, just to reiterate, the foundation for leaders, get out there and ask for feedback. Getting that feedback is going to make working on these other skill areas so much easier. Involving others is becoming an inclusive leader. Developing people is looking for ways to help people grow. Managing change is answering the why questions that employees have to help them better deal with change and uncertainty. And then number 5, engaging in conflict. Don't avoid differences of opinion, actively seek them out and facilitate a resolution of them. That's how, as an organization, you will find those win-win activities. So those are the 5 skills that I've identified from recent research over the last 2 years that really seem to be making the difference for leaders. I hope there's been some helpful tidbits that you've been able to take away for that. I know we have a few more minutes, so I'm happy to spend a little bit of time answering some questions that anybody might actually have. But I'm also very happy to continue that with you offline as well. Please feel free to reach out to me. My email address, my LinkedIn tag are there on the right. As someone who's fascinated with people, fascinated with leadership as well, I love chatting about this stuff. So please feel free to reach out for me. And well, these few minutes that we have left here, I'll just answer a couple questions. So one is the name of the leadership development model that you referenced. Let me just pop that back up. That is from Byron Hanson, and he calls it the Leadership Development Interface. So if you Google Byron Hanson Leadership Development Interface, that will actually pop up. There's a lot of great writing about it if you're developing leadership programs of how do you actually fill in each of these 4 boxes and align them together to make leadership development really resonate. It's fantastic. It stuck with me for quite a while. Saw some other things coming through about providing feedback as leaders, and yeah, for leaders, that's a critical thing as well. Um, I know for many it is a little easier as it flows downhill, that it occurs a little bit more naturally. But yeah, I'd see that as a pretty common gap for many leaders as well. So what do I think of as a common weakness or gap of many existing leadership development programs? Um, Probably that they're too much focused on a one and done. You'll come and you'll take this little class and then you'll know. And it doesn't take into account that practice is needed and that development is an ongoing process for people. Um, and that's why I often, when I'm talking with leaders, I encourage them, try it out. You're going to fail, or it might feel really awkward. That is totally natural. If you don't feel awkward as a leader, you're probably not doing it right. Um, I have yet to meet someone who I've known or anyone who's been classified as a great leader who said, "Oh, it's so easy. I just show up to work and I follow my instincts." I have not seen that happen. Maybe some of you have, but I think it's incredibly rare. I think leadership's difficult and it requires a lot of work for people. And so providing opportunities for them to practice beyond just to learn, I think is a critical thing that many leadership development programs are actually missing. Sorry, just scrolling through the questions. Oh, so one is, are you setting an unreasonable expectation if you ask people what their passions and skills and knowledge and experience are being used appropriately if there's not an opportunity in the organization for them? Um, well, I mean, I think that's a great opportunity. I don't think that an organization always needs to be the place for every employee. Um, I think having an honest conversation about that can be great in terms of a developmental aspect of, oh, really, you want to start stretching into these areas, and that's not something that this organization does. I mean, I think a leader is doing a benefit to that employee to say, well, how else could we explore that? And maybe it is in a different place. Um, I don't think a goal of having people stuck in an organization and being able to do everything is ever a goal that we actually want. And I see this empowerment of people to learn and discover and realize that maybe I do need to leave. Um, that can be a positive result as well. Um, is there some further reading you can share based on the sources you've cited throughout? I will include some information when we send out the slide deck that'll allow you to dig a little bit further kind of into each of these different areas for us. How do we develop human-centered leaders? Yeah, really that is focusing on the human component. And I think that is um, getting feedback, being more inclusive, having developmental conversations. How do you see action learning and co-development playing out in leadership development? Well, I see them as critical components. Um, Learning them in the moment really is a key thing. If it's a realistic environment, that makes it so much better. And this co-development, I mean, I see that as that's how people are bought into things. And looking at that Byron Hansen's model, it really speaks to as you align them. A part of that is then an alignment between what a leader wants to do and wants to develop and sees as kind of their leadership approach aligned with the developmental activities that take place. So it gets a tremendously high level of buy-in for people, which is just really critical. Is there a way to encourage executive management from a leader who is great as a middle manager? Um, That's a great question. I know the biggest shift that we've probably seen at Psychometrics from middle managers moving into executive levels is changing the time frame that they consider and expanding the network of people that they connect with and consider as stakeholders. So really it is opening up your world's here, opening it up to here. And so part of that is what are the implications of decisions that we're actually making, and then changing your time frame from here to actually out to here as well. So thinking a little bit more of a longer term, that's where we see middle managers have the initial kind of struggle as they move to more of those executive roles. Is it possible that people are disengaging from employers because their underlying hygiene factors are not being met? Yeah, so that was a great thing with the research that Towers and Watson did, is that they noticed hygiene factors weren't necessarily a key differentiator for people leaving, and why they weren't reporting that they were leaving. Yet with that being said, hygiene factors I see as your bare minimum. If you can't get the hygiene factors right, they don't even want to consider working for you at all. But hygiene factors are not enough to actually have people say, this is a worthwhile organization for me to stick with and consider. Um, and so focusing on people is what's actually going to drive that engagement. It will not save you money on payroll. Payroll needs to be met first. Meet people for the value that they actually bring, but it's not enough. Well, that brings us to the end. I know I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I will review the question bar afterwards and pull out the key ones and provide some response to those along with the slide deck after the fact. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending here today. I wish you well on the rest of this Thursday. And as you go forward, either developing your leadership or developing the leaders that you work with, I wish you the best of luck and hope that the focus on these 5 skills help you as you move forward. So take care, everyone.